It's time for our next lesson in our Hall of Faith series. And this might be maybe a shorter discussion today, mainly because I'm just a little ill-equipped to speak with a lot of expertise. It's actually a whole paragraph. Our next character is going to take up a little bit larger of a section than many of these characters will. It's going to be a whole paragraph devoted to this character. But I'm not sure I have a whole lot that I'm going to be equipped to dive deep into. I'm going to have maybe a little bit of a broken record observation to make, and that's okay. It wasn't a gap of knowledge that I was going to solve quickly. I wasn't going to be able to spend an afternoon on Google or a week or two doing some study. I'd have to do some pretty intense study to feel like I could speak to this in the appropriate way. But the next character is Enoch. And Enoch is this fascinating character in the text because he's got all these. He shows up in this genealogical section of Genesis, and there's this brief. Actually, honestly, the section in Genesis deals about as much with him as this paragraph in Hebrews is going to. It's a short paragraph. There's this special mention about how he walked with God and was no more. And that leads to a lot of questions. What does that mean? And there's some rabbinic conversation in the Midrash about, does it mean he walked with God for this amount of time and then didn't walk with God? Does it mean that he lived this long? Because there's the reference in the genealogy about he lived this many years, he walked with God, and he was no more. And how do you read those sections? Are they seamless? Do they go together? Are they three different parts of his life? Did he live this long and then he walked with God? And then there's all kinds of different ways the Midrash puts that together. This is a whole lot we don't know. Enoch reminds me of the character of Melchizedek. If anybody knows anything about Melchizedek, speaking of the book of Hebrews, there's so much that we don't know. There's so much mystery, so many theories that surround the name. And here's what we do know. We do know that Enoch ends up being a big part of not just Jewish Midrash about Enoch, but Enoch ends up playing a large part in just Jewish Midrash. There's the books of Enoch. I believe some of them would be related to the character of Enoch. This is where my expertise is going to. I am not an expert in the Apocrypha, in that part of Second Temple Judaism, extra biblical documents. I'd be faking it if I talked about it. But there's all kinds of things that probably could be said, but I'm not sure how many things would be directly relevant to the passage here and the author of Hebrews. And therefore, I'm not going to dance where I shouldn't dance. Let me put it that way. But here's the verse that we read. So up to this point, the author has been, let's review where we've been. The author has said we have to persevere. We can't shrink back. We have to persevere through suffering. The author says, I know that you know what it is to suffer. I know that you've stood by others who have suffered. Then the author talks about Habakkuk and talks about how Habakkuk was looking at suffering and saying, this doesn't make any sense. And yet God says, I'm doing something that you wouldn't believe even if I told you. And so Habakkuk says, all right, well, that means that the righteous live by faithfulness. They're faithful. They persevere. And so again, the writer sets up Hebrews 11, what we call Hebrews 11, by talking about there's a call, because of all the things that's been said, there's a call to persevere. We cannot give up. We cannot belong to those that shrink back. We have to persevere because, Habakkuk, God is doing stuff that we don't even understand. And so, faith, Hebrews 11, verse 1, is being confident of what we hope for, being certain of what we do not see. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. The writer of Hebrews says, just like Habakkuk learned, we have to believe that God is doing stuff that we cannot understand. We wouldn't, even if we heard it, we wouldn't understand what he was doing. And then the writer gives some examples of how that can be true. The first example the writer gives, creation. creation, everything that's visible, everything that we know, every material thing that's real, physical material reality, existed out of what didn't exist. Everything visible came out of what's invisible. And the writer of Hebrews says, make that make sense. It doesn't. Because that's what God does. That's how big the creator of the universe is. He can do things that make no material, logical sense. And then the writer talked about Abel. Abel offering sacrifices he wasn't even instructed to give. Abel choosing to believe that there's something more, something bigger, something greater going on in this world than what Abel can see and perceive and experience. And then we run into this. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. The reference there would be to Genesis 5, verse 24, by the way. If you're wanting to find that reference, Genesis 5:24. I'll start over. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. So the writer says, Enoch, that's shrouded in mystery, we just talked about that, we don't know. I don't know what any of that means. A lot of Jewish tradition and commentary doesn't necessarily know exactly what that means. There's some theories. What does it mean? All we know is that he pleased God. He walked with God. And he was commended for the fact that he walked with God. So much so that he was taken. Like there's not too many people, I'm aware of 2, that are taken before their death. Enoch and Elijah. Those are 2 Bible characters that are taken from this life before physical death takes them. So that must mean something. The writer of Hebrews taps into that. Whatever Enoch did, whatever he's commended for, his life must have meant something. And then the writer of Hebrews connects it to this idea. And without faith, it's impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So who knows what it meant that Enoch walked with God, pleased God, and who knows what that, we're not told, we're not given any other details. But the writer of Hebrews says, whatever it was though, had to have been based on faith. And I'm going to argue that here again, this next mention works with what we were just talking about. To go back and review, I think most of us read Hebrews 11 as the hall of faith. Here's all the faith players in Scripture that did faith super well. Like they were the great faithers. They were the people that faithed really well. And we think about that in terms of transactional. They believed so much that they walked righteously. And so faith transactionally produced righteousness, and because their faith produced their righteousness, they were great people of faith, and that's why they end up in the hall of faith. And just a cursory reading, we said, of Hebrews 11, that doesn't seem to be, like of all the people you could choose, those are the heroes of the faith you're going to pick. That doesn't seem to be what Hebrews 11 is talking about. So what is Hebrews 11 talking about? And that's why we went back. And that's why I propose that what the writer of Hebrews is doing is they're not saying these are the people that knew how to do faith really well. This is transactional faith. Because they believe, then they're righteous, and that's why they're named here in Hebrews 11. I believe that what's being said is that these are people who didn't believe in simply what they could see. They had faith that there was something more going on. They were able to think outside the box. They were people of hope. We might say in the New Testament they were people of resurrection. They believed that what wasn't possible could be possible. They believed that new beginnings were real. They believed, and that's what, and so when I read this story about Enoch walked with God. He was commended because of his faith. I don't know what that looked like. We don't know what it looked like. We don't know what any of this is referencing. It's shrouded in mystery, and yet Enoch was a person of faith. And we know this. We know that without faith, it's impossible to please God. You cannot, I think what the writer of Hebrews is saying, you cannot please God. See, I think we think of theological abstract transactional faith. I think Christians usually hear that verse and they think, without theological faith, I can't please God. I think what the writer of Hebrews is saying is you cannot plant your flag and just hold on to material reality, what I can see, focus on the visible, and please God. You're going to have to believe that God is bigger, that God is better, that God is up to something. You're going, in order to please God, you have to be somebody of hope. You have to be somebody that believes in, I think we would say resurrection. You have to believe that God is up to something greater than simply what we see in front of us. Faith is being confident of what we hope for. Faith, hope, certain of what we do not see, the invisible. Enoch believed there was something more, and he tapped into it, and he walked with God. And whatever his faith looked like, he believed that God existed in a world prior to the Torah, prior to the rules, prior to law, prior to theology. Somehow, Enoch tapped into a personal relationship with a God who transcends, but transcends, is bigger than simply this material, this physical, this real world. That is what I think the author is trying to say. If you're just going to hold on to what you can see, if you're not going to be a person of hope, if you're not going to be a child of the resurrection, if you're not going to believe that there's something bigger, something more going on outside of this material, physical reality, if you can't think bigger than that, you're going to find it very, very difficult to please God, because the things that God is doing are things that are bigger than this. Things that God is doing in the invisible world comes from a place that is invisible. The things that God is doing that we would try to make sense out of come from a place that don't make sense. I think that's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to invite us to. Faith is being confident of things that we hope for and certain of things that we cannot see. And that's what the ancients were commended for. And Enoch was commended for it. And without that kind of faith, it's impossible to please God. And I don't think the writer is saying without transactional, abstract, theological faith. I don't think when the writer says without faith, they're talking about affirming creeds or belief statements. Nor do I think what the writer is saying is simply like this, like willy-nilly, like, well, faith is just confidence in things that I can't see. Like a grounded, a rooted, a wide, deep, believing that there's something more that I could never understand. Believing that hope, it's not just like some flippant, you know what I'm saying? It's not this tinny, glossy, it's this deeply rooted. Enoch walked with God, and Enoch didn't even have a Bible. Enoch didn't even have a Torah. Enoch didn't even have, and yet he found God. What kind of a person finds God? Believes a God that is as invisible, as immaterial, and yes, is very much material and in our world, but also not. How does anybody find that God and walk with that God and have a relationship with that God so much that he was commended for his faith, and without faith it's impossible to please God. There are times, if we are going to persevere, if we are going to not shrink back, we are going to have to believe that there is something so much bigger than what I can see in front of me, so much bigger and better than my own suffering and my own experience, something more going on here. Because without that kind of faith, it's going to be impossible to persevere. It's going to be impossible to not shrink back. It's going to be impossible to please God. You're going to have to lean in and believe that there's something more going on, just like in Habakkuk. Just like with those people that you've stood by as they've suffered, and somehow that we've all had people in our life, people that had the cancer diagnosis. And you know and I know that it's terminal. We know how this story ends, and yet they fight. And they take their chemo treatment. And they fight to survive. And they fight to beat cancer. And we know that ultimately every story ends the same way. Ultimately death takes us, whether it's from the cancer or whether it's from something else. Ultimately death takes us. And yet why do we fight cancer? Because we believe that life is something bigger than my material, biological existence. There's something more. There's something more transcendent. And it's that kind of faith that the writer of Hebrews says this is what the ancients clung to, and this is what we cling to in the midst of our suffering. We are a part of something that people have been doing for thousands of years. Hang on to faith. May it be so. We'll see what the next character is, who the next character is, and what the next conversation might bring in the next video.